June's stomach growled as he unwrapped his last chocolate bar from Earth. The wrapper crinkled loudly in the quiet corner of Outer Station's cafeteria, a sound that reminded him of home. He had been working cargo runs for 3 months straight, jumping from one distant system to another, carrying supplies to mining colonies and research outposts. The pay was decent, but fuel costs and docking fees had eaten through most of his earnings. The cafeteria around him buzzed with the usual mix of traders, miners, and travelers. Most were eating synthetic protein bars or reconstituted meals from the food dispensers. June looked down at his chocolate bar, one of only 3 he had brought from Earth. He had already eaten the other 2 during particularly rough days when homesickness hit hard. This was his last connection to home until his next Earth stopover, which wouldn't be for another 6 weeks. As he sat there, debating whether to savor it slowly or eat it quickly to get the pleasure over with, he noticed movement at the edge of his vision. A small figure had been lingering near the food court for the past hour, moving between tables but never sitting down. June had assumed it was just another station kid, maybe waiting for parents or guardians, but now he got a better look. The figure was definitely not human. She was small, probably no older than 8 or 9 in human years, with pale green skin that had a slight shimmer under the harsh station lighting. Her hair was dark and matted, hanging in tangled strands around her thin face. What caught June's attention most were her clothes, patched and repatched with different fabrics and colors, clearly too big for her small frame. The alien girl moved. Closer to his table, her large amber eyes fixed on the chocolate bar in his hands. She didn't approach directly, instead pretending to look at something else while stealing glances at his food. June watched her for a moment, recognizing the universal signs of hunger. Her cheeks were hollow, and her movements had that careful, conserved quality of someone who hadn't eaten in a while. June had grown up in the outer districts of Seoul, where his grandmother had taught him that food shared was never food wasted. Even when their own cupboards were nearly bare, she would invite neighbors over for dinner, somehow stretching a simple meal to feed everyone. That lesson had stayed with him through his years of space travel. The girl finally worked up the courage to approach his table directly. She stood a few feet away, wringing her small hands nervously. When their eyes met, she quickly looked down at the floor, but not before June saw the hopeful expression on her face. "Are you hungry?" June asked gently, speaking in standard galactic, the common language used across most space stations. The girl nodded quickly, then seemed to catch herself and shook her head, as if admitting hunger was somehow shameful. Her amber eyes darted back to the chocolate bar, then to his face, then back to the floor. Without really thinking about it, June broke the chocolate bar in half. The rich, sweet smell of earth cocoa filled the air between them. He held out the larger piece to the girl, who stared at it with wide eyes as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Go ahead," June said with a smile. "It's from Earth. Very good." The girl took the chocolate with trembling hands, handling it like it was made of precious metal. She brought it to her nose and inhaled deeply, her eyes closing in what looked like pure bliss. When she took her first bite, her whole face transformed. The wariness and sadness melted away, replaced by wonder and joy. June watched her savor each small bite, making the chocolate last as long as possible. It reminded him of his own childhood, when treats were rare and precious. Seeing her happiness made something warm bloom in his chest, a feeling that was worth more than any chocolate bar. "This is amazing," she said in accented standard chocolate, smeared at the corners of her mouth. "I have never tasted anything like this." "Keep the rest," June said, pushing his own half toward her. "I can get more later." That was a lie. He knew he wouldn't be back to Earth for weeks, and chocolate was expensive even there. But watching the girl's face light up again made the lie feel unimportant. As she finished the chocolate, June noticed her eyeing the food dispensers longingly. He checked his credit balance on his wrist device and winced. He had just enough for fuel to get to his next job, with maybe a few credits left over for basic rations. Without hesitation, he transferred those extra credits to a disposable card and handed it to the girl. "Get yourself a real meal," he said. "Growing kids need more than just chocolate." The girl stared at the credit card, then at June, her amber eyes filling with tears. "Thank you, kind human," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the cafeteria noise. I will never forget your kindness." Before June could respond, she had darted away, disappearing into the crowd of travelers with surprising speed. He sat back in his chair, his stomach still growling, but feeling strangely satisfied. His grandmother would have been proud. June was halfway through unloading cargo containers on Titan 7 when his personal communicator buzzed with an urgent priority message. The red flashing light made his heart skip a beat. In his 5 years of hauling cargo across the galaxy, he had never received a priority alert from galactic security. He set down the container he was carrying and activated the message with shaking fingers. The official seal of the Galactic Security Division filled his small screen, followed by a stern voice speaking in clipped, formal tones. "Cargo hauler June Kim, license number GH7749 to Delta. You are required to report to Galactic Security Headquarters on Central Station within 24 hours. This is not a request. Failure to comply will result in immediate suspension of your trading license and possible detention." The message ended abruptly, leaving June staring at his communicator in shock. His mind raced through everything he had done in the past few weeks. Had he accidentally carried something illegal? Maybe there was contraband hidden in one of his cargo shipments that he didn't know about. Or worse, maybe someone had planted something on his ship to frame him. His hands trembled as he sealed up the remaining cargo containers. The job supervisor barely looked up when June explained he had an emergency and needed to leave immediately. Space haulers came and went so frequently that most people stopped paying attention to individual faces. During the 12-hour journey to Central Station, June couldn't eat or sleep. He kept running through every interaction he'd had, every cargo manifest he'd signed, every station he'd visited. The only unusual thing that stood out was his encounter with the hungry alien girl at Outer Station, but surely sharing food wasn't illegal. If it was, half the galaxy would be in prison. Central Station was massive, a sprawling complex that served as the administrative heart of the galactic government. June had only been there once before, when he first applied for his cargo hauling license. The security checkpoint alone was larger than most stations he visited regularly. After what felt like hours of identity verification and security scans, June found himself in a sterile waiting room deep within the galactic security complex. The walls were plain white metal, and the only sound was the quiet hum of air recyclers. Every few minutes, someone in an official uniform would walk past, their footsteps echoing in the corridor outside. Finally, a tall security officer with multiple rank insignia called his name. "June Kim, Commander Torres will see you now." June followed the officer through a maze of corridors lined with doors marked with various security classifications. Some doors required retinal scans to open. Others had armed guards stationed outside. The deeper they went into the complex, the more nervous June became. Commander Torres was a middle-aged human woman with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. Her office was surprisingly normal, with family photos on her desk and a half-empty coffee cup that had clearly been forgotten hours ago. But the tension in her shoulders and the way she kept glancing at her computer screen told June this was anything but a routine meeting. "Sit," she said without looking up from her screen. Her fingers moved quickly across a holographic keyboard, pulling up files and images. "Do you know why you're here, Mr. Kim?" "No, ma'am," June replied honestly. "I've been trying to figure it out since I got your message. If I did something wrong, I can assure you it wasn't intentional." Commander Torres finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Tell me about your stop at Outer Station last week, specifically your time in the cafeteria." June's confusion deepened. "The cafeteria? I just grabbed a quick bite between cargo runs. Nothing unusual happened. Nothing unusual." The commander's eyebrows rose slightly. She turned her computer screen toward him, showing crystal-clear security footage of the station cafeteria. June watched himself sitting at the small table, unwrapping his chocolate bar, and then the moment when the alien girl approached. "Oh," June said, relief flooding through him. "You mean when I shared my food with that hungry kid? I was worried you thought I had smuggled something illegal." But instead of sharing his relief, Commander Torres looked even more tense. She paused the footage on a clear image of the alien girl's face and enhanced it until every detail was visible. "This girl," she said carefully. "Someone very important has been asking about her. And specifically about you." "About me? Why?" June leaned forward, studying the frozen image. "She was just a hungry kid hanging around the food court. I gave her some chocolate and a few credits for a meal. Is that against station regulations? Or something?" Commander Torres stood up and walked to her office door, checking to make sure it was fully closed. When she returned to her desk, she was sweating slightly, despite the cool temperature of the room. "Mr. Kim, I'm going to show you something. And I need you to understand that what you're about to see is classified at the highest levels of galactic security. You cannot discuss this with anyone, ever." She pulled up another screen, this one, showing the same image of the alien girl, but surrounded by security flags and classification markers that June had never seen before. The security level indicators were all red, with warning symbols that seemed to pulse on the screen. "I don't understand," June said, his voice barely above a whisper. She was just a kid, a hungry kid in torn clothes. "That hungry kid," Commander Torres said, her voice tight with stress, "has a security classification higher than mine, higher than most planetary governors. The inquiry about you came down from the very top of the galactic government chain." June felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "But that's impossible. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old." "Pack your things, Mr. Kim," Commander Torres said, already reaching for her communicator. "You're being transferred to the diplomatic wing immediately. And whatever you do, don't mention this conversation to anyone there." The diplomatic wing of Central Station was unlike anything June had ever seen. The corridors were lined with polished marble that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. Artwork from dozens of different worlds decorated the walls, and the air itself smelled faintly of exotic flowers. Every few meters, guards in ceremonial armor stood at attention, their weapons both beautiful and clearly deadly. June's escort, a protocol officer named Lieutenant Hayes, walked quickly through the maze of corridors. "Remember," she whispered, as they approached a set of massive doors carved with intricate patterns, "you're meeting with one of the most important diplomatic figures in the galaxy. Show respect, answer honestly, and don't make any sudden movements." The doors opened silently, revealing a suite that was larger than most apartments June had lived in. The ceiling stretched up 3 stories, with windows offering a breathtaking view of the nebula that surrounded Central Station. Furniture that looked like it belonged in a palace was arranged throughout the room, and the walls were covered with tapestries that seemed to tell stories in languages June couldn't read. But what caught his attention immediately were the guards. At least 12 of them stood around the room, wearing armor that looked both ancient and impossibly advanced. Their weapons hummed with barely contained energy, and their eyes tracked June's every movement as he entered. In the center of the room, seated on what could only be described as a throne, was a figure in elaborate robes. The clothing was made from fabric that seemed to shift colors in the light, decorated with jewels and metals June didn't recognize. The figure's face was hidden by a ceremonial mask that covered everything except the eyes. Those eyes, though, were familiar. Large, amber-colored, and filled with an intelligence that seemed far older than their apparent age. June's breath caught in his throat as recognition dawned. "You may approach," the figure said, and even though the voice was different, more formal and commanding, June knew without a doubt who he was looking at. As he walked across the room, his footsteps echoing in the vast space, the figure reached up and removed the ceremonial mask. The face underneath was the same as the hungry alien girl from outer station, but transformed. The hollow cheeks had filled out, the matted hair was now clean and styled, and the torn clothes had been replaced by robes that probably cost more than June's ship. "Hello again, kind human," she said, and now June could hear the same gentle voice that had thanked him in the cafeteria. "Please sit. We have much to discuss." June sank into the chair across from her, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. "You're her, the girl from the station, but this is impossible." She smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the child who had savored his chocolate bar. "My name is Ambassador Nari Veltar, heir to the throne of the Kellan Empire and representative of the Outer Rim Coalition. But you knew me as a hungry child looking for kindness in a cold universe. I don't understand, June said, his voice barely working. You were homeless, starving, your clothes were falling apart. They were meant to be, Nari replied, gesturing to one of her guards, who brought forward a tray with refreshments. For the past 6 months, I have been traveling throughout this sector of the galaxy, visiting different worlds and stations, but not as an ambassador. I disguised myself as an orphan, a beggar, someone society would ignore or push aside. She poured herself a cup of tea that smelled like cinnamon and starlight. Do you know why I did this, June? No, Your Highness, June said, not sure how he was supposed to address someone who was apparently royalty. Please, just call me Nari, she said with a gentle smile. The Kellan Empire has been watching humanity for decades. Your species has applied for membership in the Galactic Council 17 times. Each time you've been rejected. June felt a familiar sting of disappointment. Every human knew about the Council rejections. It was one of the reasons so many humans worked as cargo haulers and miners in the outer systems instead of the more prestigious inner worlds. The Council has many concerns about humanity, Nari continued. They worry that your species is too aggressive, too selfish, too focused on individual gain rather than collective good. Some members believe humans only show kindness when there's something to be gained. That's not true, June said, then immediately worried he had spoken out of turn to someone so important. But Nari nodded approvingly. I hoped you would say that. You see, I designed a test. I would travel disguised as someone worthless, someone with nothing to offer, and see how different species treated me. Most beings I encountered either ignored me completely or actively drove me away. She set down her teacup and looked directly into June's eyes. On Vega Prime, a Centaurian merchant called Security to have me removed from his shop. On New Tokyo, a group of human teenagers threw garbage at me and told me to get a job. On Kepler 7, station security threatened to arrest me for loitering. Joan felt ashamed of his own species, even though he had done nothing wrong. But then I met you, Nari continued, her voice growing warmer. You had so little. Your credit balance showed you were nearly broke. That chocolate bar was probably the only luxury item you had. And yet when you saw someone hungry, you shared it without hesitation. You gave me your last credits for a meal, even though it meant you would go hungry yourself. Anyone would have done the same thing, June said, quietly. No, Nari replied firmly. That's exactly what makes it special. You believed anyone would do it, but in 6 months of testing, you were the only one who did. She stood up and walked to the great windows overlooking the nebula. The Kellan Empire controls 47 star systems and has significant influence. So over 200 more. Our recommendation carries enormous weight in the Galactic Council. June's heart began to race as he understood what she was saying. Because of your kindness, because of what you showed me about humanity's capacity for selfless compassion, I am formally recommending that the human species be granted full membership in the Galactic Council. Tomorrow, I will present your actions as evidence that humanity is ready to join the galactic community. June sat in stunned silence, unable to believe that sharing a chocolate bar could have such enormous consequences. Nari turned back to him with a smile that held both the innocence of the child he had helped and the wisdom of someone who would one day rule an empire. Sometimes, she said, the smallest acts of kindness echo across the stars. 3 days after his meeting with Princess Nari, June found himself in the most intimidating room he had ever entered. The Kellan High Council chamber was a circular amphitheater carved from what looked like a single massive crystal. Representatives from dozens of alien species sat in tiered rows, their eyes all focused on the small platform in the center where June stood alone. The lighting was dim, except for a bright spotlight that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. He could hear whispers in languages he didn't recognize, and the translation device in his ear picked up fragments of conversations about the human test subject and questionable evidence. Princess Nari sat in the front row with the other Kellan nobles, but she wasn't allowed to speak during this phase of the proceedings. She had already presented her case for humanity 3 hours earlier, showing security footage of June's kindness, and arguing that it represented the best of human nature. Now it was up to the council to decide if they believed her. Elder Thane, the ancient Kellan who served as council speaker, rose from his ornate chair. His voice carried easily through the chamber, without any amplification. A trick of the crystal. Acoustics that made every word seem to come from everywhere at once. "June Kim of Earth," he began, his tone formal and cold. "Princess Nari has presented compelling testimony about your actions. However, the Council remains divided on whether one individual's behavior can represent an entire species." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled representatives. June caught glimpses of beings with scales, fur, and features he couldn't even identify, all nodding their heads or making gestures that seemed to indicate skepticism. "Many here argue that your kindness was merely an accident," Elder Thane continued. "Perhaps you were having a good day. Perhaps you acted without thinking. Perhaps you were trying to impress someone watching. How can we know that your actions represent genuine human nature, rather than a momentary impulse?" June's mouth felt dry as he tried to think of how to respond. "Your Honor, I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just saw a hungry kid and wanted to help." "So you claim," said a voice from the upper tiers. A reptilian being with brilliant blue scales stood up. "But humans are known for their capacity for deception. How do we know you're telling the truth?" Another representative, this one looking like a walking tree with glowing amber sap, added, "Even if you are truthful, one act of kindness does not balance against your species' history of warfare and exploitation." The criticisms continued for what felt like hours. Representative after representative stood up to list humanity's failures, from ancient wars on Earth to recent conflicts with mining corporations in the outer systems. June found himself defending not just his own actions, but his entire species' right to exist among the stars. Finally, Elder Thane raised his hand for silence. "The Council has debated long enough. We have decided to implement a final test." The chamber fell completely quiet. Even the whispered translations stopped. "June Kim, you will be given a choice. The Kellan Empire is prepared to offer you a reward for your kindness to Princess Nari. This reward will be substantial enough to ensure you never need to work again. You could buy your own ship, your own space station, even your own planet if you wished. You would live in luxury for the rest of your life." June's heart pounded. The amount of money they were talking about was beyond anything he had ever imagined. He could stop hauling cargo through dangerous space routes. He could visit Earth whenever he wanted. He could buy his aging mother the medical treatment she needed, and still have enough left over to live like royalty. "However," Elder Thane continued, "you also have a second option. You may choose to decline the personal reward and instead request that the equivalent value be invested in programs to benefit all of humanity. Educational exchanges with alien civilizations, technology sharing agreements, funding for deep space exploration and colonization efforts." The choice seemed obvious to June, but Elder Thane wasn't finished. "Before you decide, understand this. If you choose the personal reward, there will be no judgment from this council. You will be free to leave with your wealth, and humanity's application for Galactic Council membership will be evaluated based on other criteria. But if you choose to benefit your species instead of yourself, it will be taken as evidence of humanity's readiness to think beyond individual gain." What Elder Thane didn't say, and what June couldn't know, was that hidden cameras were broadcasting his decision to representatives from 47 different star systems. Trade unions, military alliances, and diplomatic coalitions throughout the galaxy were watching to see what this simple cargo hauler would do when faced with the choice between personal wealth and collective benefit. In a private viewing room, Princess Nari watched the proceedings with her advisors. Her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Everything she had argued for, everything she believed about human nature, would be proven or disproven in the next few minutes. "What do you think he'll choose?" asked one of her counselors. "I don't know," Nari admitted. "The amount we're offering him is life-changing, more money than most beings see in 10 lifetimes. It would be perfectly reasonable for him to take it." But even as she said it, she remembered the way June had given away his last chocolate bar without hesitation, the way he had transferred his final credits to help a stranger get a meal. Those actions hadn't been calculated or planned. They had come from something deeper, something that couldn't be faked or performed for an audience. Back in the chamber, June stood in the spotlight, feeling the weight of thousands of alien eyes upon him. He thought about his cramped cargo hauler's quarters, his empty bank account, his mother's medical bills back on Earth. The smart choice, the practical choice, would be to take the money and solve all his problems at once. But then, he thought, about all the humans still struggling in the outer systems, working dangerous jobs for barely enough pay to survive. He thought about the children growing up on mining colonies who would never see Earth, never have the opportunities that Galactic Council membership could provide. The decision, when it came to him, felt as natural as breathing. June looked around, the massive crystal chamber one more time, taking in the faces of beings from across the galaxy who were all waiting for his answer. The spotlight felt hot on his shoulders, and he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. The amount of money they were offering would solve every problem he had ever had. He could buy his mother a house near the best hospitals on Earth. He could get his own ship instead of renting one. He could eat real food instead of protein bars for the rest of his life. But then he remembered something his grandmother used to say when he was young. She would tell him that a person's true character wasn't shown when times were good, but when they had to choose between helping themselves or helping others. She had lived through the food shortages on Earth decades ago, and even when their family barely had enough to eat, she would still share with neighbors who had even less. "Your Honor," June said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber, "I appreciate the generous offer, but I can't take that money for myself." A ripple of surprise went through the assembled representatives. Several beings leaned forward, in their seats, clearly not expecting this response. "Instead, I want all of it to go toward programs that will help humanity grow and learn. Set up student exchange programs so young humans can study on other worlds. Fund research projects where human and alien scientists can work together. Use it to build better ships for exploring space and finding new homes for people who need them." The moment June finished speaking, the chamber erupted. Representatives were standing up, talking excitedly to each other in dozens of different languages. The translation device in his ear was overwhelmed, picking up fragments like unprecedented, decision, and truly altruistic species and remarkable display of collective thinking. Elder Thane raised his staff for silence, but it took several minutes for the noise to die down. When he finally spoke, there was something different in his voice, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "In 300 years of serving on this council," he said, "I have never seen a being refuse personal wealth of this magnitude to benefit their species. This decision speaks louder than any testimony or evidence we could examine." Princess Nari was practically glowing in her seat, though she maintained her royal composure. But June could see the excitement in her amber eyes, the same joy he had seen when she tasted chocolate for the first time. The vote that followed was unlike anything in Galactic Council history. Usually, decisions about new species membership took weeks of debate and multiple voting sessions, but as Elder Thane called for the formal vote on humanity's application, representative after representative stood to voice their approval. The Centaurian Republic votes in favor. The Vegan Trade Alliance approves membership. The Crystal Collective supports humanity's inclusion. One by one, every single representative in the chamber cast their vote in favor. When the final tally was announced, it was unanimous, something that had never happened before for a species. Membership vote. The chamber erupted again, this time in celebration. Beings who had been skeptical of humanity hours earlier were now applauding and cheering. June stood in the center of it all, still hardly believing what had just happened. Princess Nari made her way down to the chamber floor, her royal robes flowing behind her. When she reached June, she did something that shocked the entire assembly. Instead of offering him a formal handshake or bow, she hugged him like the child he had first met in that grimy cafeteria. "You did it," she whispered in his ear. "You showed them what I saw in you that day." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. June found himself at the center of galactic news coverage, with reporters from dozens of worlds wanting to interview the cargo hauler, who had changed everything. But what he remembered most clearly was the message he received from Earth. It was a video call from his mother, her wrinkled face filled with tears of joy. Behind her, he could see neighbors crowded into their small apartment, all watching the news coverage on their old television screen. "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Your grandmother would have been proud too. You did exactly what she would have done." The Galactic Council moved quickly to establish the programs June had requested. Within months, the first human students were arriving on alien worlds, while alien researchers were setting up laboratories on Earth and Mars. The cultural exchange program became so popular that they had to expand it 3 times in the first year. June was offered the position of Earth's first cultural ambassador, a role that involved traveling between worlds to help establish these new relationships. But he insisted on keeping his cargo hauling job part-time. He said he liked meeting regular people from different worlds, not just diplomats and politicians. Years passed, and the story of June's choice became legend throughout the galaxy. Human children learned about it in school, but so did alien children on dozens of other worlds. The tale of the cargo hauler who gave up wealth to help his species became a teaching tool about the power of selfless decision-making. Princess Nari, who eventually became queen of the Kellan Empire, would often tell the story at diplomatic gatherings. She would describe how a simple act of sharing food had revealed the true nature of an entire species. At the new Galactic Diplomatic Academy, young humans training to become ambassadors would study June's example. Their instructors, both human and alien, would remind them that the most powerful diplomatic tools weren't weapons or money or political leverage. Sometimes the greatest strength was simply showing kindness to someone who had nothing to offer in return. June himself became something of a reluctant celebrity, though he always insisted he had just done what anyone would do. When reporters asked him about his decision to give up the reward money, he would shrug and say it was obvious. "My grandmother always told me that we're only as strong as the weakest person in our community," he would explain. "How could I take money for myself when there were so many people who needed help?" The galaxy had learned an important lesson from a man who shared his last chocolate bar with a stranger. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can echo across the stars, changing the course of entire civilizations.